Week 9, Session 1, Discussion Platform, Women's Movement. If you recall, the last prompt questions of our last session urge you to ponder on the fundamental micropolitical contradiction in the civil rights and Black Power movements. Today's session should give a pertinent perspective to reflect on the question. The official birth of women's movement goes back to 1848, when the first Women's Rights Convention was held in the Seneca Falls, New York. The convention adopted the women's version of the Declaration of Independence called the Declaration of Sentiments. Between 1896 and 1917, the women's suffrage movement focused on the state-level suffrage right, which led to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Carolyn Johnson opens up her chapter on the modern feminist movement with a dramatic depiction of the first protest against the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City by a group of feminists from New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. This media-conscious protest event marked the resurgence of women's movement and feminism with a bang. According to Johnson, after the passage of the 19th Amendment, women's movement stagnated. During World War II, women are mobilized into the workforce due to the demands of war. After World War II, however, women were pushed back to the Fordist nuclear family factory. Betty Friedan's feminist mystique expressed the state of the domestication of the middle-class women in the Fordist nuclear family factory. Quote, each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? Unquote. It was the baby boomer generation born between 1946 and 1954 that witnessed firsthand the stifling domesticity of their mothers trapped in a nuclear family and hostile work environment in the public sphere. According to Johnson, this generation of women that grew up, quote, in the shadow of atomic bomb were impatient for social change, unquote. In other words, the resurgence of women's movement in the 1960s was partly instigated by the refusal of the disciplinary and normalizing power of the Fordist social factory, fortified by the Truman Doctrine and Pax Americana. Characteristically, the new wave of women's movement was bent on the changes in both macro and micro political realms. They favor decentralized collective model rather than bureaucratic model of decision-making process. They involve direct actions not only against the underrepresentation, discrimination, and oppression in the macro-political realms, but also against the patriarchal imposition of the sense of identity, imagery, and body. Furthermore, the new women's movement saw the consciousness raising as a critical means of bridging the macro and micro-political realms. Johnson also traces the genealogy of radical feminist movement in the women's reaction to the sexism within the civil rights movement. In 1964, young African-American female members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee staged, quote, a half-serious, half-joking, unquote, sit-in the SNCC office, protesting their domestic role in the organization, which led to the formal position letter of protest against sexism within SNCC in 1965. The differences between radical and moderate constituencies of the feminist movement revolved around the theory and strategy over marriage and family. While the moderate wing sought reform and restructuring of marriage and family, the radical wing sought to abolish marriage and traditional family. Moreover, the differences also manifested themselves along the intersectionality of race and class. While the middle-class white women were engaged in a consciousness-raising effort to reinvent their autonomous identity, African-American women's concern was more on pragmatic issues such as economic survival unemployment, children's education, and adequate child care. The difference in orientation reflected the differences in the experience of the Fordist factory. In contrast to the white middle-class women domesticated in the suburban nuclear household, African American women and other women of color were confronted with racism and sexism in the labor force. The articulation of the intersectionality of race, class, and sexuality has become the focal point of feminist movement in the African American community. Although the development of feminism and women's movement in the 1960s has produced diverse sub-movements and groups, the unity has been maintained around the critical issues that are common to all women. Johnson discusses the two common areas of solidarity: the struggle for equal rights amendment and reproductive freedom. The Equal Rights Amendment sought to establish the equality between men and women in macro and micro political arenas. The amendment passed the Congress in 1972, but failed in the state ratification in 1982. But the momentum for the passage entailed a mass movement consisting of 450 organizations with 5 million in membership. Despite the failure of ratification, the momentum was sustained in the betterment of women's condition in laws, employment, child care, media representation, and reproductive freedom. The landmark Supreme Court decision known as Roe v. Wade in 1973 guaranteed women's reproductive freedom. Since 1973, however, the reproductive freedom has been contested by the state-level legislations and also by the so-called pro-life organizations that have chosen extra legal measures to challenge the Roe v. Wade decision. The recent health care overhaul also highlighted the enduring conflict over women's reproductive freedom. The macro-political changes brought by women's movement in the 1960s include 3 major legislative acts: the Equal Pay Act of 1963, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the Executive Order 11375. An exponential increase in the percentage of professional women in the field of law, medicine, and government offices. The achievement is also indicated by the growth of women's studies that started in 1969 at Cornell University. By 1971, according to Johnson, 600 courses in women's studies were offered in 200 institutions. It is quite evident that the American women's movement, propelled by the dynamic energy between its radical and moderate constituencies, has made a significant advancement in the well-being of womankind as a whole in a very short time.